A very warm welcome to everyone on the first instalment of At Home With, which is a spin-off of the Equality Now Recommends newsletter, where we suggest books, films, TV shows, and art with a feminist edge that we think that you will enjoy. I'm Patricia Amira, and on the main, I'm a broadcaster for both radio and television, normally based out of Nairobi, but currently I'm on lockdown in the heart of southern Scotland, but I'm also a trustee of Equality Now. And if you're new to Equality Now, we're an international women's rights organisation that takes on discrimination in the law, challenges ingrained cultural assumptions, and calls out inequality wherever it exists, along with our countless local partners around the globe. At Home With is a comfortable conversation with authors, filmmakers, and artists about their work and their thoughts on the world. And we want you to be part of the conversation. I'll be asking your questions in each episode, which you can submit in the Q&A section of the webinar, so please be sure to. And if you want to share this session on social media, please use the hashtag @HomeWith, and of course, tag Equality Now. Now, today we have the absolute pleasure of talking to multi-award winning journalist and author Christina Lamb, OBE. She is the chief foreign correspondent for the Sunday Times and has written 9 books, including the best-selling The Africa House and I Am Malala, co-written with Malala Yousafzai. Her most recent book is Our Bodies, Their Battlefield, What War Does to Women. Now, Christina has covered wars from Iraq to Libya, Angola to Syria. She's been based in Islamabad and Rio de Janeiro, Johannesburg, and Washington, DC. And she has a particular focus on issues that affect women in conflict, such as girls abducted by Boko Haram, Yazidi sex slaves in Iraq, and the plight of Afghan women. Hi, and welcome, Christina.
Thanks, Patricia. It's great to be with you virtually.
I know, it's great, isn't it? Now, you've had some absolutely incredible and, dare I say, harrowing experiences too over the past 30 odd years. Let's start off with what prompted your choice to be a war correspondent?
Actually, it's kind of an odd time to be a war correspondent as we can't travel at the moment. So I actually spent today interviewing London bus drivers, which is quite different, but are on a different kind of front line because more bus drivers are dying than any other section in the UK. Wow. So I never set out actually to be a war correspondent, to answer your question. I always wanted to write and I wanted to travel, and I had never really thought about being a journalist because I had never met a journalist until I went to university. And my parents read a not very good tabloid newspaper, which maybe I won't mention. So it wasn't something that was very much on my radar, but I loved reading. And then at university, friends invited me to a free cheese and wine party. And being a student, free cheese and wine seemed like a good idea. So I went along, and it was for the university newspaper. And the people spoke about the things they were doing, and I thought this sounds really interesting, and so I got involved and ended up actually editing the paper. And so when I left university, I interned at the Financial Times, and one day the foreign editor was supposed to be going to a lunch of South Asian politicians, and last minute he couldn't go, so he said to me, "You're always going on about India. I traveled in India when I was a student. Why don't you go to this lunch?" So I went and sat next to somebody who was the Secretary General of the Pakistan People's Party, which was the opposition party led by Benazir Bhutto. And he asked me if I'd like to interview Benazir. Well, at that time, she was living in exile in London, and Pakistan was a military dictatorship. So of course I said yes. So I went to interview her. And we got on very well. And actually the day that I went to interview her was the day that she announced her engagement to Asif Ali Zardari. So her apartment in London was absolutely full of bouquets of flowers. I'd never seen such beautiful flowers. Anyway, she then went back to Pakistan. I got a job for a TV company in Birmingham. One day I came home from work and on my doormat was the most exquisite gold engraved invitation that I had ever seen. And it was to Benazir's wedding in Pakistan.
Goodness.
So of course I went.
Yes.
And it was my first ever visit to Pakistan, and being Benazir, her wedding was really spectacular. I mean, South Asian weddings anyway, if you've been to one, are really colourful and long, but hers went on for like 10 days and was really like something out of the Arabian Nights. But the other thing was that every evening after all the kind of ceremonial events, there would be these meetings with her political colleagues about how to try and topple the military dictator. And so all these people were telling me about being arrested and tortured and tear gassed. And I'd never met anybody who'd been through anything like that. And they were doing this to try and bring democracy to their country, which was something I had always taken for granted. So I was fascinated, and I really didn't want to go back to covering local news in Birmingham. So I came back, gave in my notice, and went off to live in Pakistan. But sorry, this is a long answer to your question, but I'm going to get there.
It's a wonderful answer.
When I spoke to foreign editors of British newspapers about freelancing for them from Pakistan, actually nobody was interested in Pakistan. They all said, well, General Zia has been in power for 11 and a half years and we don't think anything's going to change. But what they did say was, we are interested in Afghanistan, because at that time the Russians were occupying Afghanistan. And so it was like kind of, it ended up being the last fight of the Cold War. And so they said we'd be really interested in that. So I went to Pakistan and went to live in Peshawar on the border of Afghanistan, and started traveling in and out of Afghanistan with the Mujahideen fighters who were taking on the Red Army.
Now, I've watched a few of your interviews, and there's one thing that struck me. You've spoken widely about how at the Rwanda Genocide Tribunal held in Arusha, Tanzania, there were 4 women who gave their account of the genocide, and they mentioned that they had been raped. The judges weren't interested, but thankfully there was one female judge who then said, hang on, wait a minute. And it went on to become the first international conviction of rape as a war crime, which is a very significant thing. Now, as a female war correspondent, you're in a very small group. How do you think you've influenced how conflict is reported? And from that, what difference do you think you've made to the lives of the people whose lives you've written about?
Well, I wouldn't like to assume that I really made any difference to how war reporting is done. I mean, people like me were very much influenced by people who came before us, like Martha Gellhorn, and people when there were very few female correspondents. I just saw an amazing documentary about Lee Miller, the war photographer, or model as she was as well, and an artist, which was fascinating. Anyway, so when I started, you know, we were still very few. It's very different now. But I think, I mean, I didn't consciously do this, I just did it naturally, but I always spoke much more to the women. I was never really interested in the actual, what we call the bang bang, the fighting. I don't like that, honestly. I'd rather not be somewhere where people are shooting at each other. But I am completely fascinated by how you live in that situation, you know, when all hell is breaking loose around you, and how do you still keep life together? How do you still educate your children and feed them and look after the elderly? And I've always been absent. And of course, that's mostly the women doing that. And to me, they're the real heroes. And some people are making comparisons today with our situation and wars. And it's not exactly the same because, you know, we're kind of at home watching Netflix or Zoom webinars. We're not facing bullets. But, you know, our world did suddenly change almost overnight. And, you know, it is interesting how very quickly you get used to this kind of new normal where people will hardly go out, people wear masks, people avoid each other on the streets. So, you know, maybe because I'd been in many difficult situations over the years and I've seen the resilience that people actually do have when they are in these situations, it made me more confident that we would be able to deal with this than perhaps some people might have been. Yeah.
Okay, so tell us about your latest book, which was only recently launched, I think. Was it 12th of March, I think, was it?
Yeah, people say that I had the last book launch in London.
There you go. Tell us a little bit about it, please, Christina.
It seems like another world now.
Yeah.
And honestly, I mean, it's awful really, but we were joking that night about, you know, passing round canapes and hand sanitizers. And then a group of us went to an Italian restaurant to show solidarity with Italy, not thinking at all, this is going to be us in a few weeks, and actually worse. So yeah, things changed quickly. So yes, so my book actually comes out in America in September. It came out in the UK in March, and it's called Our Bodies, Their Battlefield. And it is a book about the use of sexual violence in conflicts, the use of it as a weapon, and how difficult it is to get justice. So it's kind of trying to tell the stories of women in war that often get written out of history, but it's also very much focused on the brutality against women. And war rape is a war crime, and yet it is so little prosecuted. It is the most neglected war crime. And I decided to write this book because as a reporter covering conflict, it just seemed to me that I was seeing more and more brutality against women, and I didn't really understand why it should be getting worse. So I started talking to people about it and became quite obsessed by the subject and angry about it.
Yeah. So violence as a weapon of war and control over women in and outside of conflict is an issue that, as you've said, is overall still not addressed in the way that it should be. Now, there's the backdrop of Me Too in the Western world, the experiences of women in refugee camps. There's the rising rates of domestic violence globally that we're hearing more and more about during this pandemic as well. What practical action do you feel needs to happen, and by whom, you know, to get to the root of the issue?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, obviously, you know, the Me Too movement is a good thing, but we saw how difficult it is for women in the West to come forward and to speak and talk about what happened to them, the way that they're often vilified and, you know, end up having to go into hiding, and they're often the ones that are criticized rather than the people that actually carried out these horrendous acts. So if you imagine that that's happening to women in New York or London, what it's like for women in places like DRC or Central African Republic or Rwanda at the time, where the very people that are perpetrating these crimes are the people running the country, or their militias are controlling the area where the women live. And so it's so difficult to try and get justice. And the other thing is that in many of these places, most of the places I would say where I spoke to people, you know, it's the women who are castigated and ostracized afterwards. So instead of getting support, they're the ones that are forced out of the village, which is why it makes such an effective weapon. It's an easy way to humiliate a society, to destroy families, destroy communities. it's extremely effective, which is why it's used by so many of these groups. And so, I mean, not my first involvement with it, but the first time that I really realized the scale and horror of it was talking to Yazidi girls who'd been captured by ISIS in 2014, 2015, kept as sex slaves and sold from one to another. So, for example, I met one girl, Naima, who'd been passed on 12 times between people as if she was a goat, you know. And so hearing those kind of stories, it's just so horrendous. I think perhaps one of the hardest stories I've ever heard was a 16-year-old girl who'd been kept as a sex slave by a fat ISIS judge in Raqqa. And she told me that the worst night of her life was when he came back with a 10-year-old girl and raped the 10-year-old girl in the room next to her. And she heard the girl crying for her mother the whole night. So, you know, when you hear stories like that, you know, this should not be going on in this current time. You know, this is a war crime and these women need justice. So you asked me what should be done. You know, we need to be pushing our politicians in our countries to really push for justice in these places, to not have relations or deal with these other countries unless they're taking proper action on things and trying to stop this. Because honestly, I could have carried on writing my book forever. I think it's happening in so many different places around the world on such a scale, and it is so extremely difficult to get justice. There's not been a single prosecution for any of what happened to the Yazidis. There's the first case just started in Germany, actually, of an ISIS guy and his wife. But in Iraq, all of the ISIS people that have been captured, and thousands of them have, none of them are being tried for what they did to the Yazidi girls. And it's the same in Nigeria with Boko Haram. Any of the people that are captured, they are not tried or charged with what they've done to all the thousands, tens of thousands of girls that have been taken. The Rohingya, who were tied to banana trees by Burmese military and gang raped, often in front of their children. Sometimes the children were killed by the soldiers. None of those Burmese military have been brought to justice. And, you know, until that starts to happen, this isn't going to change. But it also is, you know, the first step is even just acknowledging it. You know, we have history books about things that don't mention at all what happened to the women in the wars.
Yeah. You know, having seen firsthand the complexity of women's experiences, is there one story that you could tell us about that kind of stands out to you personally, almost like your yellow flower in a sea of concrete?
Do you mean a story of a particular?
Yeah, that just stands out to you personally, that you think there might be some hope.
Well, I mean, when people ask me, why do you do this job? Why do you keep going to bad places? That is what I say, really, that, you know, you do meet the most amazing people doing remarkable things in difficult places. And that is what really keeps me going. I find it quite hard to single out one person because I mean, luckily have met a lot of people doing really impressive things and risking their lives in places to try and make a difference. Again, mostly women. So I've been lucky enough to work with Malala, who risked her life to try and bring education to children, which shouldn't really be a controversial thing in my view.
Yes. Yes.
And I also worked with an absolutely adorable Syrian girl called Nujeen, who has cerebral palsy and had never been to school. She can't walk, and she lived in a 5th floor apartment in Aleppo, and there was no elevator or anything, so it was really difficult ever to get her out. So she used to watch TV the whole day And she taught herself absolutely fluent English from watching TV. And in particular, so if anyone from America is listening, her favorite TV program was a soap opera called Days of Our Lives, which she was obsessed by. And it was very funny to me because so they fled Aleppo during the bombing. And she said to me, the most annoying thing about the bombing was that they kept having power cuts, so she couldn't follow what was happening in Days of Our Lives. And apparently it was a really crucial time with a love triangle. And anyway, Nujeen and her sister managed to get all the way from Aleppo to Germany with her sister Nazreen, who's a real hero, pushing the wheelchair. And Nujeen is one of these people that just makes you feel better about life. If you spend a day or an hour with her, you just feel like happier about she has a gift. And yet, you know, her life has been incredibly difficult. So things like that, I think. And she's just so funny too. When I first met her and she just got into Europe through this really difficult journey, you know, it's very difficult to be a refugee anyway. No one wants you. Everyone's trying to kick you out. It's difficult. People were being tear gassed, turned back, beaten. The conditions were dreadful. And to do that in a wheelchair is just astonishing to me. And yet, you know, she had a smile on her face the whole time. And I said to her, what do you think of Europe? And she said, oh, I'm a bit disappointed by it. So I was a bit like, oh, why? And she said, well, the thing is, I used to watch MasterChef all the time, and I thought the food would look like that.
And it doesn't. It's fish and chips down the chippy. Okay.
So it's kind of things like that that just, you know, it make you laugh and
yes, and keep a smile in your heart. Okay, we've got some questions coming in, and I can see we're fast running out of time. So let's field some of those in. Liz in Southampton. Is there emerging conflict you think the world should be watching right now?
That's a very good question. And actually, I'm really worried about the situation right now because, you know, the world hasn't stopped, right? Wars haven't stopped. I know that the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, called on for a global ceasefire because everyone has to focus on fighting coronavirus, but you know that hasn't happened. In fact, in some places like Afghanistan, which I'm particularly passionate about and have spent a lot of time in, you know, there's more fighting. There's an average of 50 to 70 attacks a day at the moment by the Taliban. So, and Yemen as well, there's also fighting. So I'm worried that we're focused so much on what's happening in our countries and the battle against coronavirus. And of course, I understand why, because thousands of people are dying. But, and also, you know, our economy has all been brought to a halt. Yes, and we don't really know how we're going to get out of all this. But, you know, things haven't stopped elsewhere. And also some places and some people are taking advantage of the situation and knowing that no one's really watching, so they can do bad things and get away with it. And actually, somebody said to me last week, dictators love lockdowns. And this is true, that people are using it to be able to, you know, suppress their opposition, close down journalists, lock up opponents, keep people at home and not able to do anything. And so we're seeing more and more countries where autocrats are in power, imposing things more. And it's not just, I'm not just talking about faraway places which might seem less relevant to us. I mean, this is happening in Europe. In Hungary, for example, is basically a dictatorship now. The Viktor Orban awarded himself emergency powers as using the coronavirus as an excuse, and you know, is basically now in complete dictatorial control. And we're seeing that in a number of other countries too. Poland is also really become very repressive. So it's not one particular place, but I think we're seeing, you know, a lot of places. And I think, you know, we don't know how all this is going to play out, but there is going to be a whole, discussion afterwards about who's handled this more effectively. Is it better to be a democratic country or an autocratic regime? And so we'll see.
Okay. We've got another question from Fran. What demands should we be making now for change in political setups to reflect the new global situation, even though we're not quite sure what that global situation is?
Well, I mean, sadly, as you know, we've seen a rather complete lack of global leadership in this situation. I mean, in the past, we would have looked to the United States really for leadership and we're not seeing that even within the United States. So the idea that, you know, and it's, you know, America first, there's no really thought about America helping the rest of the world in this. But within Europe, you know, each country is very much, you know, just looking out for itself. There's competition between countries for resources. So, you know, I'm afraid that this isn't showing up world leaders in a very good way. And it is interesting, some people are pointing out that the countries that have done better seem to all be run by women.
Ah, yes.
It's a coincidence.
You've seen that meme going around. Yes, I have. I've seen it too. Yes. I have very quickly, I'm going to slip another question in. Do you have any advice or a book or a film recommendations for educators who wants to help bring these facts regarding sexual violence and conflict to light in the minds of young people? Excellent. Yeah.
Well, I'd like them to read my book.
Yeah, we could start there, right?
Yes, thank you. I mean, the fact is, there's not actually that much written about this. I mean, when I started writing on this, I thought there would be lots of books written, and there isn't. So, yeah, I mean, there are some good films. There's a film called The Prosecutors, which is sort of documentary film following 3 very brave prosecutors in DRC, in Bosnia and Colombia, all prosecuting cases on this and showing, you know, how incredibly difficult it is. And there's also a very good film called The Uncondemned, which tells the story of what you mentioned earlier on about Rwanda and these amazing women who, through their tenacity and bravery, brought the first ever conviction for rape as a war crime in the world. And I think, you know, many people don't realize that that first conviction was through Rwandan women.
Yes, and only just recently, really, to be honest.
Yes, it was only just over 20 years ago.
Yeah, yeah. Really, we've got a minute left, so I cannot take any more questions, but thank you so much for, you know, to the audience who've been bringing those in. And just thank you so much as well, Christina. It's been great to spend a little time with you.
Well, it's been great talking to you. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you also to our audience. For those of you who would like to buy Christina's book, Our Bodies, Their Battlefield, What War Does to Women, we'll send a link to all of you, along with links to how you can support Equality Now's work. This episode of At Home With has been recorded and will be sent via email and will be available to view and share at equalitynow.org. Next week, we'll be speaking with economist and author Vicky Price to talk about her new book, Women versus Capitalism. Until then, thank you for joining in. And if you have any suggestions for Equality Now Recommends, by the way, of what we should be watching, reading, listening to, what we need to be loving right now, do let us know. For now, stay home and stay safe. Bye-bye. There's the book there. Thanks, Christina. Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you.